Personal liability. What exactly does it mean? It means exactly what it sounds like. You're personally liable. Whether you're young or old, male or female, licensed or not. As a professional, you are personally liable. I'm an employee of a big firm. Okay, you're still personally liable. Professional negligence. Firms are not professionals. In a few states, firms, in fact, are permitted to practice engineering. Nonetheless, you are still personally liable. And while a lawsuit against you may not require you to shell out your own money, it will require you to shell out your own time. And it will require you to compromise your sense of self-worth, your self-respect, how you think about yourself, because, oh no, I'm being sued. There's a claim against me. They're saying I'm incompetent. They're saying I'm no good. They're saying I don't even meet the standard of care. They said that every mouth breather in town is better than me. There are any number of emotions that you go through. None of them are any good. You want to avoid this stuff. You don't want to have to go through it at all. My purpose in focusing on this topic today, the bottom line, is to make you aware that you are personally liable so that you will have the backbone required to ask important questions. It is sometimes difficult for people who don't have the world's best experience in business to ask probing questions. Sure, you can do it with a smile, but nonetheless, it's, like, where is your money coming from? For a lot of people, this is a very difficult question to ask. However, when you realize what's at stake, it becomes a little bit easier to ask those questions. How long does your liability last is sometimes, a question. In some cases, you have to understand the liability will, in essence, follow you into your grave. And when they put dirt on your coffin, it jumps out of the grave and goes into the wallet of your heirs, because in essence, they will be unable to close your estate until the lawsuit against you is settled, believe it or not. Now, you've probably heard of statutes of limitations and statutes of repose, and it's important to understand what these are because they can affect different parts of your practice. A statute of limitations begins to run upon discovery of a defect. In other words, let's say that you designed XYZ 20 years ago, and today they discover, hey, it's defective. There is a 5-year statute of limitations, meaning that from today till 5 years from now, they have the ability to file a claim. That is a statute of limitations. A statute of repose, which does not exist in all states, but in most states, is different. A statute of repose begins to run, or as they say, begins to toll from substantial completion. For example, if there is a 10-year statute of repose and you completed a project 10 years and 1 day ago, guess what? Your liability for it is over. Except that. There are exceptions all over the place. It may not apply to environmental services. It may not apply to engineering services except those associated with real estate. And there may be various types of exceptions for different types of latent defects, whether or not, for example, it was known or unknown and so forth. In other words, while the statute of repose is very good and works in many cases, it is hardly fail-safe, and it, just like so many other things, can be breached, and if that is breached, then your liability, your personal liability, can last forever. Several years ago, Terra Insurance Company identified among its insureds, actually about 70% of its insureds, firms that had never had a claim in more than 15 years. They wanted to determine what are these firms doing that results in such an amazing record, given that their insureds are civil engineers, geotechnical engineers, construction materials engineering and testing consultants, the kinds of technical professionals who frequently get sued. And here you have all these people not getting sued, all these firms not getting sued. What's going on? What are they doing? They identified 7 significant traits that these firms, in fact, had in common. One of the most important of all was detailed client project selection. They wanted to help ensure that there was good compatibility between the clients they work with, the projects they accepted. As a consequence, there were far fewer problems. I sometimes draw an analogy to this aspect of the terror research, not to be too stereotypical, but there are any number of fathers of teenage girls who, before they get into a vehicle driven by a teenage boy, want to ensure that there are certain basic safety precautions in place.
Oh, boy.
For example, a father may say to his teenage daughter, look, I want you to make sure, first of all, that this is a good, upstanding boy in the community. How many years was he a Cub Scout? How many years was he a Boy Scout? And after that, how many years was he an Eagle Scout? What is his vision? Have you checked it out? Is it corrected or not? I want to be sure it's 20/20. Okay, what about his driving record? First, ask to see his license and then check it out with the Department of Motor Vehicles to make sure he doesn't have any kind of tickets at all for anything, okay? And then you check out the car. It's okay, get underneath it, look at the brakes, check out the tires, make sure it has seat belts, okay? Also, I want you to be sure that that vehicle used to be a tank in the Army, okay? That's right, 5th Cavalry, it's gotta be good, plenty of pillows inside, bags and everything in case something bad happens. Okay, so maybe that's an exaggeration, but not that much of one. It's amazing to me that as common as these kinds of feelings are, there are any number of technical professionals who will readily get into a client's vehicle without so much as asking, do you have a license? Do you know how to drive? Does the vehicle have brakes? And so forth. The client says, come on, I'm going down the road. You want to come with me? And the technical professional says, sure, and jumps in the car, closes the door. As the car starts moving, as the project vehicle starts barreling forward, the technical professional says, gee, I notice you don't have any seatbelts in the vehicle. And the driver, the client, says, yeah, that's right. They weigh the car down too much. And what about brakes? Ah, they're useless. Why use brakes when I can slam into a tree? And just as the vehicle gets ready to plow into a tree, boom! The driver disappears. You know why? Because the driver is, let's say, a limited liability company or whatever. So who's left in the vehicle? You. Well, my firm is a limited liability company. Yeah, but you are personally liable. You don't get out of that vehicle. Not unless they have, for example, the jaws of life. And the jaws of life, open it up and you take a look and there's an insurance company and a bunch of lawyers. And man, you got a long, bad road ahead. When it comes to projects and clients, there are certain general facts that we are aware of based upon dozens and dozens of case histories. We know, for example, that residential projects tend to be far more problematical than any other kind, in part because as a technical professional, you owe what's called a duty of care to every single home owner. That home could be a condominium, it could be a townhouse, it could be detached or whatever, but you owe a duty of care to each. And for the most part, the people who own these homes are not sophisticated commercial developers or public owners. They are homeowners who really don't understand what the purpose of a baseboard is. And if a baseboard comes off and they happen to see the wallboard is kind of, crinkly on the end, they tend to get very upset. And when they go into court to press a claim, they usually have the sympathy of the trier of fact, a judge or a jury, and therefore they commonly win. So this in and of itself, the fact that they win so often, creates a situation that encourages them to recoup what they believe are their damages. Not a good situation. We also know that nonprofit organizations, country clubs, churches, and the like, tend to be very high-risk clients because the decision maker tends to be a committee of 7 or 8 people. As a consequence, they're slow to respond to situations. They sometimes have ego clashes. They forget things from meeting to meeting, in part because you'll have 6 people at one meeting and a different 6 at the next meeting, and it's like working with a client representative that changes brains in between meetings. So one of the things that you really need to do, again, because it's your butt that's on the line, right, is you need to do some reading. You need to educate yourself about the typical kinds of projects that tend to be more risk-prone than others. Identifying projects generically as high risk, low risk, medium risk, or whatever doesn't mean that you take the high risk projects and say, well, we're not going to do these because the risk is too high. It means simply that you understand what the risks are and try and set into motion, with the assistance of client representatives, a good plan that helps manage the risks. The client representatives don't want to have trouble in their projects. You don't want to have trouble on your projects. As a consequence, you work together to develop a plan to identify the risks and manage them. No matter how much you know, in general, of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that the specific project moves along just that way. You need to ask questions always about a specific project, and you need to ask more questions when you haven't worked for a client before, or actually for a client representative before, even if you've worked for the client before. Depending on the nature of the project, you may want to ask, tell me about the project. How big is it? What do you have in mind for it? How much is it going to cost? Where is the money coming from? Now, in the case of, let's say, a major national or international corporation, you don't really have to ask, where is the money coming from? But in the case of some type of commercial developer, for example, that is an appropriate question, because one of the things you want to be certain of is that enough money has been allocated to pursue this project in a proper manner so you don't have to cut corners. Shortcuts are the fastest road to liability hell. You don't want to go there. That's why you ask these questions, and again, your butt is on the line. You need, therefore, to ask these questions even though you may prefer not to. What's the budget? Where is the money coming from? Those are important questions to ask. What is your experience in projects like this? Have you ever done one before? One of the known risks is a novice developer. And there are any number of people, realtors, attorneys, accountants, surveyors, other professionals, and others, who will work in a given field for a number of years and then say, you know what, I'm tired of doing this for a developer. I can do this myself. Only to realize that it is a little bit more complex than they thought. And they then start cutting corners, looking for free help, looking for other sources of money, and you may be regarded as a source of money. That's not good. So if this is a first-time developer, for example, you want to ensure that you have appropriate precautions in place. Your butt, the line. You need to ask, have you ever dealt with a firm like ours before? If the answer is yes, you ask, which firm? If the client representative says, I'd rather not tell you, say, no problem, I don't need to know, have a good day, I'll see you around. Leave. You have every right to know which firm. And you also have every right, every need to ask, why aren't you dealing with them now? One of the common answers to that question is, well, we've had philosophical differences with that firm. Ah, philosophical differences. I bet you didn't take philosophy in college. So what you want to do is contact a representative of the firm that used to be engaged by the client and find out what exactly are these philosophical differences. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why you want to maintain good collegial relationships and serve as a colleague liaison, because that way you can call and get this kind of information. Probably what you're going to find is the basic philosophical difference was this. The firm believed in being paid for its services, and the client believed in stiffing them. Many firms say, well, it's okay. Let's be optimistic. Optimism is a bad thing, by the way, in your business. But let's be optimistic, and we will insist upon a retainer, and that way we won't have difficulties getting paid. Time out bad thinking. Here's the deal. If a client is not a good payer, if the client is looking to service providers and contractors to act as a source of a loan, it means that the client is underfunded for the project. That's not a good thing. It means that client is already planning to take shortcuts. Or if the plan for shortcuts is not already in place, then the client will be taking shortcuts later on. Don't think that just because you've been paid, you don't have a problem. You have personal liability. If a certain biohazard happens to strike an impeller blade and the client or owner has to bail, who is left holding the bag? You are personally liable and you can't get away from it. If the only party available to sue is you, they will find a way of reaching you. They will trump up some sort of something and come after you with at least the hope that you will be willing to spend $50,000 to settle a worthless case as opposed to spending $100,000 to prove it was worthless. That's the way our legal system works. Follow appropriate guidelines. Be your own best friend. Remember, personal liability, your liability, inescapable. Clients can be divided into two broad categories: private sector, public sector. In the private sector, other than for major corporations, clients typically work with what's called OPM, other people's money. Now, it may come from a bank, it may come from some kind of pension fund or something like that. But nonetheless, that's where the money comes from, and typically they will move forward when they have almost enough. It's one of the reasons why you need to do a credit check or something akin thereto before accepting the assignment. A number of years ago, when the savings and loan, you probably don't even remember what they were, but there was a thing called the savings and loan industry, and it got into terrible trouble, and any number of savings and loans, bank-like institutions, had to be bailed out by a company called the Resolution Trust Corporation. And they were selling any number of buildings dirt cheap. Nonetheless, it was pretty silly to go out and buy a building that needed a tremendous amount of work. There was one particular person who was out there buying a lot of these buildings, and he was very quality oriented. He retained a friend of mine, a structural engineer named John, and he said, "John, I'd like you to do this work." And John said, "Well, I wouldn't mind doing it at all." And John, being an astute engineer who never had a claim, started asking questions. The questions he asked were essentially those that you would see on a form someone would fill out in order to obtain credit, because John was aware of the fact that in accepting a commission, he was also giving out risk credit. In other words, the risk that his company would have to bear, the risk that he would have to bear personally by accepting a project. So John asked questions. What is the name of your company? Is this the first such company you've had? What are the names of some of the other companies you've had? Where do you bank? What are the names of the loan officers involved? And so forth. Because he was going to do follow-up checking to make sure that this individual was creditworthy. What are the names of some of the other firms you've worked with, and so forth, because John was not about to risk his own future to help meet the services required by this particular client. As John was asking the questions, the client representative was obviously becoming more and more alarmed. And John said, I'm sorry if I'm bothering you, I have to ask these questions. And the client representative said, and he said, no, he said, I have to tell you, he said, I've been doing this for 25 years. He said, I've been working with design professionals, environmental consultants, architects for 25 years. In all that time, this is the first time any one of you has ever asked questions like this. I didn't think any of you knew anything about business. The client representative reaches into his briefcase and pulls out a pro forma. There are all the questions that John was asking, and then some, with all the answers all typed out. He said, look, he said, anyone in the private sector has to have a pro forma. He said, you don't have to ask these questions. You just ask, let me see your pro forma. If somebody in the private sector that's using OPM doesn't have a pro forma, you don't want to deal with them. They don't know what they're doing. He said, and by the way, he reaches down, he pulls out another sheet. He said, here are some additional questions to ask. These are the ones I ask when people come to me to borrow money. Let me tell you, John and that client representative got along real well. You may say to yourself that the public sector, the other kind of client, well, that offers much less risk. Wrong! Generally speaking, from what we know of the data, the number one most litigious client there is small towns, small government agencies, because almost invariably they try to do too much with the budget available. There's a public clamor for this or that. Let's get it done, even though we don't have quite enough money. Now, if problems arise, who's going to get sued? Probably everybody. But you are likely to be target number one because you're in a position to say, here's some money, go away. There's another thing that comes up in dealing with the public sector. Often the client representative will say, listen, we want you to start on this project now because the money is going to be coming forward in the next budget run. Okay? Let me tell you, the money may not be coming forward in the next budget run for any number of reasons, and you will not be paid for the work you've done, and the work may be left unfinished. Who knows what can occur, but the fact of the matter is, no matter whom you're working for, public sector, private sector, college, university, church, synagogue, mosque, it doesn't matter. Make sure the money is available. Make sure the money is adequate to support quality. We're going to end now just where we began. Understand personal liability. It can be severe. You will have it in some cases for as long as you live and may even pass it along to your heirs. It's something you need to be aware of and need to deal with intelligently. Select your clients and your projects with care. Above all, remember, your butt, the line, move forward intelligently.
Brown bag.